welcome to Wetpixel Live. My name's Adam Hanlon. I'm the editor of Wetpixel, and we'd like to thank CCAM for sponsoring this episode. CCAM do a huge range of housings, ports, domes, and some great strobes. So please go and check them out at ccamAsItSounds.com. I'm joined today by my friend and regular contributor, Alex Mustard. Morning, Alex.
Hi, Adam. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. What we thought we'd talk about first of all today was a thread on the forum, which affects me personally, but affects many image makers, and that's that the very popular Nikon D500 has been officially discontinued. Nikon have stopped making them, and equally upsetting possibly is that they've also not announced any kind of replacement. So they haven't announced an APS-C or a crop sensor replacement. So it looks at the moment as if Nikon has no longer is going to offer a crop sensor SLR. And that sort of brings to mind the whole, and I think the thread in the forum bears this out, where the camera industry is going. So I thought I'd ask Alex, and Alex has been a long-term SLR and mirrorless camera users. So I thought I'd ask him for his sort of insight on where he thinks the digital camera industry is going for us as underwater image makers.
Well, I think the writing is to some extent on the wall that it is the end of SLRs as the main offering from these camera companies, and that the future is mirrorless. And whether you like that or not, I think that's the way that the market is clearly going, and I think you'd have to have your head in the sand to try and pretend in any other way. I think that it doesn't mean that SLRs will cease to exist, but I think that having a huge range of options within SLRs is obviously going to diminish, and I suspect that all the latest trick tech is going to end up in the mirrorless cameras, because it clearly makes a business case sense if you're an original equipment manufacturer like Nikon, Canon, Sony, Panasonic, Olympus. You don't want us to be carrying on with SLRs. You want to get us into mirrorless cameras where we're going to end up buying a whole new set of lenses. And also I think there's more headroom for expansion there. There are areas where the mirrorless cameras don't quite perform quite right yet, and that's ideal. Persuade us into this new gear, and then in 2 years' time you can tell us, well, actually, that thing we told you was good, we've now fixed it because we've now made it really good. And this other thing that we're all kind of moaning about, we fixed that as well. And I think that you can see why they want that to go. I think it's also important for those looking from the outside to be aware of this factor, that the SLR cameras these days are so good that it's very hard for a camera manufacturer to come up with anything more game changing. They've kind of maxed out all the resolution, the megapixels. The autofocus is excellent. The frame rates are very high. They really don't need to be any higher. Certainly as an underwater photographer. And the ISO performance is excellent, as well. And there isn't really any headroom for them to create new specs in SLRs that they can really make us change. And as a result, people are hanging on to their cameras. In the early days of digital underwater photography, cameras would come along every 2 years, every 3 years. That would be absolute no-brainer upgrades. And we'd all be upgrading our cameras and housings every 2 and 3 years. And I think we really need to change that attitude in our minds and change away from thinking that it's a 2 to 3 year cycle and we get new toys. And actually that these are cameras that we're going to be using, 4 to 10 years. And I think that has quite a lot of implications, particularly in terms of the housing manufacturers and things like that. And with bearing that in mind, I think you have to also, a lot of underwater photographers look to what the housing manufacturers and the dealers are saying about the new gear and that sort of thing. You have to remember that they are also part of the industry that is going to be sustained by you upgrading. So they're, of course, going to be very pro upgrade and pro whatever's new. But actually, for me, I would look at things a bit differently as an individual and say, well, if I'm going to be keeping my cameras for every 4 to 10 years, changing them every 4 to 10 years, I'm not necessarily that bothered about having the housing that's first to market. I want the housing that's going to work really well after 5, 8 years, not the one that is, arrived 3 months before the other one. Yeah.
And this is a subtle change in the way we consume, isn't it? In that, suddenly when we're keeping a housing for extended periods, things like the ability to get it serviced locally,
Yeah.
relatively locally, things like dealer support, things like, these sort of things. So we exist in a culture where a lot of people will go online and buy it at the cheapest price they can find and ship it wherever it is from whichever corner of the globe, and then it comes. But suddenly, actually, when you're keeping a housing for much longer period of time, or a system for much longer period of time, it's not just housings, then actually that post purchase support, the relationship with the dealer becomes actually much more important. And I think we're returning. That used to be the case back in the film days, and I think we may in some ways be returning to that. And I have to say, it's something I sort of welcome. I quite like the idea of getting hold of a system and getting to really know that system really well and shoot it to its absolute maximum of its ability before I move on. I think a lot of the time we've been in a situation where the pace of change has been so rapid that we actually probably haven't completely mastered or got to grips with the previous model before we're moving on to the next one. So yeah.
So I think that although the end of days for SLRs is clearly coming, the cameras, we shouldn't forget that the cameras that we have really are truly excellent, and that they produce image quality that really can do absolutely anything that we want to do now and for the foreseeable future. So if you are an SLR lover, then there's no reason to switch to mirrorless cameras. However, if you are a photographer who's inspired by new technologies, new capabilities, then you're much more likely to find those things coming along within the mirrorless realm.
And also, if you're a user that's using the camera for a variety of uses, so shooting sports on land, for example, or shooting birds in flight, or then there's no doubt that some of these new technologies are going to make a big difference on the images you can create or the images you can capture. But for underwater, where we're generally dealing with things like, and an example you mentioned, frame rates. Frame rates for underwater photographers, we're limited by our recycle time of our flashes, not how fast the camera can cycle pictures through. Now, there's always going to be a few people who shoot in ambient light, and that's all they do. Fine, in which case this doesn't apply. But the majority of underwater images are captured creating flash. So for us, really, having a crazy high frame rate is not. I mean, it's not a bad thing, but equally, it doesn't really do us any benefits underwater. So
I know, Adam, that you're teased on the forum of being an SLR old timer, which I think is really good. I think it's always really valuable. Anyone who was involved in Wetpixel in the early days of Wetpixel knows the number of film photographers who occasionally come on the forums and fire shots at everyone saying digital's rubbish, digital's got no future, film's the only way to go. And you certainly don't want to get stuck in the same rut as an SLR photographer now relative to a mirrorless photographer. So I'm going to turn the question to you and say, what are the key things that keep you shooting an SLR over mirrorless? And before I sound too high and mighty, I would add that I own both SLR and mirrorless cameras, and my SLRs remain my primary choice of cameras. So I'm not I'm on Adam's side a little bit, but I'm going to make him squirm, telling me why he's choosing an SLR.
So there are two primary reasons, and the first one, well, perhaps I should preface this. I don't have a huge amount of experience of the very latest mirrorless cameras. I have used some earlier generations of the Nikon specifically, but I haven't used, for example, the Z9. So please bear that in mind.
I'm not sure anyone has underwater yet.
Yeah, I think it's very few. Yeah. So, but the two major problems that I have or the reasons that stop me from changing over is, first of all, the issue of autofocus. And for me, and again, it's personal, this is where my shooting style, I rely on autofocus. Ultimately, I can fix, to some extent, exposure, tone, all that kind of things in post. I can fix noise in post. What I can't do is I can't fix a camera that's out of focus. Picture that's out of focus. And so the first thing is, and is my experience is that currently, the fact that a separate phase detect sensor in combination with contrast or various other detectors on a sensor is still the best way of achieving fast, accurate autofocus. And I'm sure I'm going to be wrong in the future. This is a fast-growing area, but as of right now, I still feel that's the case. And autofocus is important to me.
So I think what I'd say to that is that there are types of underwater photography that are very autofocus intensive and
Yeah.
types that aren't.
Yeah.
And I think if you're the type of photographer who does, one type of photography, for you, autofocus is not a high priority. If you do another type of underwater photography, it is. If you like shooting blackwater subjects, if you like shooting, fish portraits, things like that, that is very autofocus intensive and good autofocus really makes a difference between catching those perfect poses and
Yep.
missing those perfect poses.
Yep.
I think other types of underwater photography, for example, dark inside caves or big animal photography or scenic wide angle photography is less autofocus intensive. And
Yep.
super macro as well, I would probably argue, is also not autofocus intensive because we usually use a fixed focus for that and
Yep.
rocking in and out to do the focus. So I think it's important to qualify that autofocus is essential and good autofocus is a real differentiator in some types of underwater photography, but doesn't become important in others. Anyway,
And that's
what was your other second?
That probably reflects my in that I tend to shoot a wide variety of genres of
No, I
underwater
wasn't
photography.
criticizing you. I was going to make
no,
a
no,
point for anyone
no,
listening.
yeah.
And what was this? You said there were two big reasons.
The second big issue is lens compatibility, and there's no doubt that the new lens mounting flanges on most mirrorless cameras presents really exciting opportunities for optical performance. And that's probably going to be a good thing, particularly on land, landscapes, that kind of thing. I'm unconvinced about super high optical performance underwater. I want acceptable optical performance, but not necessarily superb. Having said that, things like the Nikon RS lenses, the 28-70, which is the choice for using behind the WACP. So any Nikon screw mount lens, which are older lenses, the obviously the Takinas, not so much for crop sensor. None of these lenses will now work with mirrorless cameras, and that to me is a I want a choice of lenses that I can use for underwater, and those will involve fisheyes. There are some good macro solutions coming out, and that's a good thing to see. But as yet, none of the major camera manufacturers actually really announced. None of the Nikon and Canon or Sony haven't announced fisheye lenses, and to me, as an underwater photographer, that's a huge area. Now, yes, I can use lenses with adapters, but what's the advantage? I don't gain the advantage of using mirrorless at that point. I may as well just stick to what I've got. If they were to come out with a native fisheye, then that would probably change that equation somewhat. But there's no one seems to be doing it, and it may be something a third-party lens manufacturer is going to do. I think
it's just a case that these will come.
Yeah.
There's no way that when 90% of photographers are using mirrorless cameras, that we won't have all the lens options that we used to have. I think the exceptions will be those two you mentioned as a Nikon user, the Nikonos 13mm for those that use it. That won't be adaptable to mirrorless SLRs easily.
Yep.
And I think that will be a loss because there won't be a modern equivalent of that lens because there isn't
antique already.
A modern equivalent for SLRs. It's an old anyway. And then also the fact that the WACP-1 was designed very much with that Nikon 28 to 70mm lens for it. And I think even though you'll be able to use a WACP-1 with mirrorless cameras, I actually think it's the simple design of that old Nikon lens that actually makes it work so well with the WACP optics. And the more complicated the lens you put behind it, the less easily it meshes with the additional lens of the converter. So I do think those two will take some, but I suspect what will happen is Nauticam will make a WACP-3, which will be optimized around a mirrorless mid-range zoom. And then I think that problem will go away. So I think that those are problems of the current, as opposed to the future. The areas that I don't like mirrorless, and there's a couple of small ones first, is first of all the sync speed. Quite a lot of the mirrorless cameras don't have the same sync speed. I know the Sony A1 is a different
outlier.
It does have a better sync speed with flash, but given that most underwater photography is done with flash, giving away sync speed is a pity. Now, I know we've done videos, on here saying, well, there are now strobes with HSS. So if you're an HSS user, yes, you can get away from that a little bit. But that is an issue because, any underwater photographer who's ever shot wide angle or macro underwater knows that there are times that they're jolly glad they can have every bit of sync speed possible.
And the HSS is not a solution because you're still reducing the power of the strobe. So you're not going to get a full power strobe dump on HSS.
Yeah.
So there are compromises. It's not one doesn't replace the other.
And I think, as we've already commented on, I think quite a lot of the specs that are shouted most loudly about mirrorless cameras are the super high frame rates, because obviously without a mirror there, they can just turn it up as fast as the chip can handle. I think that they have very limited appeal underwater. There are sometimes, particularly I would say, action photography available, like, bait balls, that sort of thing, where they could be quite fun to really capture a moment. But actually, the most famous bait ball photo is Doug Perine's photo, which is taken with flash. So it's not a high frame rate shot, and it's the flash that actually reveals the detail in the subject. So, I'm not convinced about super high frame rates being a game changer. And then the super high ISO range, again, there are very narrow parts of underwater photography that really need super high ISO. The areas that do, there is potential for some real exciting new images in that area. But ultimately, most diving is done in a sort of light range. And I think that, we already have a huge ISO capability, and adding a few more stops to the end of that, I don't think, at the upper end of that, I don't think it's so important. One thing that is slightly frustrating for me is that the cameras are moving away from low ISO shooting, which land photographers, sports photographers, nature photographers, landscape photographers, that's no issue for them. But as underwater photographers, low ISO is really valuable in dealing with bright ambient light when you're working with flash, because you can't just turn your shutter speed up. So low ISO capability is really important for us as photographers. And, having to add physical barriers like neutral density filters is not a workable solution. It makes everything darker, and it's just, so I think that's something I'm concerned about, is the loss of low ISO.
They all seem to go 100, don't they?
Those lower ISOs, the number of shots, when I do my reboot teaching course, I actually show all the ISOs I use. And, I use those, very low ISOs on the D850 all the time, particularly for macro. It's particularly for stretching into those, for macro to allow me to shoot more open apertures and not have the ambient light overwhelming things. The one area that all mirrorless users tend to moan about is battery life. And I think SLRs still have a hold on that. And it's simply because a camera with a powered screen or a powered electronic viewfinder running all the time obviously sucks more battery. And for whatever reason, and I know that the Z9 bucks this trend, mirrorless cameras, they've decided to put smaller batteries in them. Which makes no sense. You design a camera that uses more battery, and then you fit a smaller battery. That doesn't make any sense to me. So,
it sort of knocks the idea of them being pro bodies, doesn't it? One of the big differences with SLR between the pro and the non-pro bodies was the size of the battery. And yes, you said the Z9 does buck that trend, which maybe suggests that's where they're headed.
Now, if you're a diver who does every dive, out from a dive resort, do one dive, come back, or out from a liveaboard, do one dive, come back, changing a battery every dive is no big deal. But if you're doing more adventurous photography, maybe out on a small boat all day, shooting all day, or you don't always have that capability of being able to change battery. So, battery life doesn't have to last for weeks, but it should be able to deal with a day of photography. And some of the cameras aren't there. The area that frustrates me when I shoot my mirrorless cameras the most, though, is shooting wide angle with electronic viewfinders. I find that the fact that a typical wide-angle underwater scene is a silhouetted foreground and the sun in the background, something like that. And with an optical viewfinder, you look at that scene and you can see the detail in the sun. You can see that the diver or the shark is swimming in front of the sun, and time your photo for that. But you can also see that the reef is in focus, that the areas that you want are correctly composed in the foreground. And one of the frustrations with current electronic viewfinders and using screens is that they can't show you that huge dynamic range, which you're not trying to capture in the photo because you're going to fill that shadow with flash. But you have that problem. Now, the plus side is that electronic viewfinders can, with their gain boost, can be really valuable for helping you focus on super macro subjects where it's very dark. You don't want to use a focus light to scare the pygmy seahorse. So there's definitely exciting futures in this. but there needs to be, we're still waiting for a little bit more progress on those electronic viewfinders, so we get all the advantages without the disadvantages. So for me, that's why I'm also still SLR over mirrorless. It's kind of for me, it's a number of small factors as opposed to any one big game changer. But as a competitive photographer, I want those factors in my corner helping me get better shots than the next guy. So maybe we should be saying this video, everyone switch to mirrorless, so that we get an advantage over you.
I also do think, and that the future, whether we like it or not, is going to be mirrorless.
Yeah, absolutely.
When the current crop of SLRs, and there may be one or two generations left, we don't know, when they go, and as they will, then we're all going to be dragged in there. So I guess this is one of the ways where Wetpixel can be useful, because sharing techniques for dealing with the kinds of issues that we've highlighted. There are techniques, there are ways people shoot that enable to get around these things. That's a really good place to share that information.
Maybe if you are a D500 owner, the best thing you can do is hold on to it. Maybe in 5 years' time, it will be worth more than it is now.
I think by 3. Yeah. Thank you, Alex, very much. I think, Alex, you alluded briefly to a good idea, but I mean, obviously, one of the best ways of figuring out what's good in a camera system is looking at what camera systems can produce. And I know, that I think your keywording on your website includes what camera it's been shot with. Am I right in saying that?
Well, it's part of the metadata, so it's searchable.
Yeah, it's on there. So you can look on there. But equally, so if you go into amustard.com, have a look on there. There's options of comparing. But equally, I think certainly when I share images on social media now, I tend to add my camera settings and the camera it's been shot with. So have a look around, see what other people are doing, and see what mirrorless shoots are doing, and make your own mind up then. And I think that's probably the best way of doing it. So thank you very much, Alex. It's a pleasure as always, and thank you to CCAM for sponsoring this episode. We really appreciate our sponsor support, and we can't make this without these. I anticipate this might be a topic that creates some discussion. So please feel free to add comments, but probably even better, go over onto the Wetpixel forum and let's chat about things on there. And obviously, if you enjoyed this or got something from it, please drop us a like. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you again soon.